Willkommen zur Pressekonferenz nach dem bilateralen Gespräch von Bundesentwicklungsministerin Schulze und dem WFP-Exekutivdirektor David Beasley. Mein Name ist Nicola Fichtner, ich leite das Pressereferat im BMZ. Die Ministerin wird gleich auf Deutsch sprechen, Mr. Beasley wird auf Englisch sprechen. There is simultaneous translation via Webex for those who need it. Später wird es die Gelegenheit für Fragen geben. Dafür schreiben Sie bitte Ihren Namen in den Chat. Dann kann ich Sie der Reihe nach aufrufen. Jetzt fangen wir an mit den Statements mit der Bundesentwicklungsministerin Schulze.
David Beasley, sehr geehrte Damen und Herren, wir befinden uns in einer wirklich sehr ernsten internationalen Lage und damit meine ich nicht nur die Ukraine, damit meine ich auch die Situation in vielen Entwicklungs- und Schwellenländern, die derzeit unter den Folgen des russischen Angriffskrieges leiden. Es ist in dieser Zeit ungeheuer wichtig, dass unser Blick wirklich weit bleibt, dass wir unsere Partner nicht alleine lassen. Denn wenn wir hier in Deutschland über steigende Preise im Supermarkt reden und natürlich darunter leiden, bleibt Millionen Menschen in Entwicklungsländern als dramatische Alternative nur noch der Hunger. Der Klimawandel, die Pandemie, die zunehmenden Konflikte in vielen Regionen der Welt und ein russischer Präsident, der über seinen verbrecherischen Krieg gegen die Ukraine hinaus auch noch Hunger als Waffe einsetzt, all das gibt eine sehr, sehr gefährliche Mischung, die weltweit Millionen Menschen in den Hunger treibt. Und es ist gut, dass es den Vereinten Nationen im Sommer gelungen ist, die Getreideexporte aus der Ukraine über das Schwarze Meer wieder zu ermöglichen. Das wirkt entlastend. Aber das Problem ist damit nicht gelöst, zumal wir alle gelernt haben, niemand sollte sich auf Putin verlassen. Und es gibt auch weitere Krisentreiber. Der Dünger wird immer teurer, wird immer knapper. Gründe dafür sind hohe Energiepreise, der russische Angriffskrieg gegen die Ukraine und eben Handelsrestriktionen von Russland. Und das hat fatale Folgen für die nächsten Ernten. In vielen Ländern Afrikas wird Düngermangel voraussichtlich zu einem deutlichen Produktionsrückgang führen. Das ist etwas, was wir gerade noch mal sehr intensiv diskutiert haben. Und wir können deshalb bereits heute absehen, dass sich die Ernährungskrise höchstwahrscheinlich im nächsten Jahr noch verschärfen wird. Und dazu kommen noch die wachsende Schuldenlast, die dazu führt, dass viele Entwicklungsländer die Importe nicht mehr bezahlen können. Viele Ernährungssysteme in Entwicklungsländern haben sich viel zu sehr von importierten Weizen, von Mais, von Reis abhängig gemacht. Und deswegen dürfen wir jetzt in unserem Engagement nicht nachlassen. Die Antwort muss eine Politik sein, die Entwicklungsländer wieder stärker zu Produzenten macht und die Importabhängigkeit reduziert. Es reicht nicht, Getreidesäcke und Wassertanks zu liefern. Es reicht nicht, die Symptome zu bekämpfen. Wir müssen an die Ursachen ran und darum arbeiten wir daran vor Ort, nachhaltige, klimaangepasste und effiziente Agrar- und Ernährungssysteme aufzubauen. Und konkret bedeutet das mehr lokaler Anbau mit klimaangepassten Sorten statt immer nur Weizen, Mais und Reis, mit effizienteren Dünge- und Bewässerungstechniken, mit lokalem Kompost und zum Beispiel mit Tröpfchenbewässerung. Wenn Ernten ausfallen und kleiner werden, dann müssen wir aber auch den Kampf gegen die Lebensmittelverschwendung stärker in den Blick nehmen. 30% der Nahrungsmittel weltweit gehen verloren oder werden eben verschwendet. Und dieser Appell richtet sich auch an uns selber. Lebensmittel sind ein kostbares Gut, deren Herstellung einen hohen Ressourcenaufwand erfordert. Und gerade wir im globalen Norden müssen uns fragen, wie wir die Verschwendung von Lebensmitteln reduzieren können. In Entwicklungsländern geht es darum, um Kühlketten, um Trocknungs-, um Lagertechnologie, um lokale Weiterverarbeitung. Und all das kann dann sogenannte Nachernteverluste reduzieren. Und das ist eine entwicklungspolitische Aufgabe, der wir uns stellen und die wir weiter ausbauen wollen. Und das Welternährungsprogramm ist unser wichtigster multilateraler Partner bei der Bekämpfung des Hungers weltweit. Heute habe ich mit David Beasley die Ausweitung der Zusammenarbeit in 27 Ländern vereinbart, die eben ganz besonders von der globalen Ernährungskrise betroffen sind. Dafür unterstützt mein Ministerium das Welternährungsprogramm in diesem Jahr mit Mitteln in Höhe von 530 Millionen Euro. so viel wie noch nie zuvor in einem Jahr. Der Schwerpunkt liegt auf der Sahelzone, dem Horn von Afrika, aber auch in Ländern des Nahen Ostens. Und ich bin sehr dankbar, dass wir diesen starken Partner World Food Programme haben. Das alles hilft den betroffenen Ländern, aber um die strukturellen Ursachen des Hungers global zu bekämpfen, brauchen wir starke Allianzen. Als Reaktion auf die Ernährungskrise habe ich gemeinsam mit der Weltbank im Kreis der G7 das Bündnis für globale Ernährungssicherheit initiiert. Das Bündnis bringt mehr als 100 Regierungen und Organisationen zusammen und unterstützt eben das schnelle, das koordinierte Handeln auf der internationalen Ebene. Aktuell planen wir im Rahmen dieses Bündnisses die ersten sogenannten Länderdialoge und Ziel ist es dabei, in ausgewählten Ländern wichtige Akteure, eben unter anderem auch die Expertinnen und Experten des World Food Programms, miteinander zu verbinden, um dann eben genauer zu sehen, wo ist Finanzierungsbedarf, wo sind Lücken, und die dann eben gezielt auch anzugehen. Und diese ganzen Ergebnisse fließen in das sogenannte Global Food Security and Nutrition Dashboard, das das Bündnis jetzt hat, ein. Das ist eine interaktive Karte mit Informationen eben zur Ernährungssicherheit, zu Finanzierungsvorhaben und zu Forschungsergebnissen. Gemeinsam mit der Weltbank werden wir dieses Dashboard am 9. November der Öffentlichkeit dann auch zugänglich machen. Und es wird uns helfen, unser Handeln besser zu koordinieren, zu wissen, wo sind eigentlich welche Lücken und wie können wir sie schließen. Dieses Engagement ist aber noch lange nicht vorbei. Der Einsatz gegen die Hungerkrise ist ein Langstreckenlauf und letztlich geht es bei allem, was wir tun, nicht nur darum, die aktuelle Hungerkrise zu überwinden. Wir müssen zugleich so nachhaltig vorgehen, dass die nächste Krise eben nicht noch schlimmer wird oder dass wir sie bestenfalls vermeiden. Und da arbeiten wir sehr, sehr gerne mit dem World Food Programme zusammen, mit David Beasley zusammen. Und deswegen freue ich mich, dass wir heute hier gemeinsam Ihnen das vorstellen können.
Vielen Dank, Frau Ministerin. Mr. Beasley.
Svenja, thank you so much. It's always great to be with you, and we truly are facing an unprecedented crisis. Literally, when we had met back in January before the Ukraine crisis, we were already gravely concerned that 2022 would be the worst humanitarian crisis since World War II. And then when you think it can't get any worse, you have the breadbasket of the world, a nation that produces enough food to feed 400 million people, all of a sudden becomes the nation with the longest bread lines in the world. And it's hard to believe that it was just about 5 years ago, there were 80 million people, as we would say, marching to starvation out of a planet of about, that time, about 7.8 billion people. I thought we were going to be able to put the World Food Program out of business because we were making so much progress. But the number went from 80 to 135 right before COVID hit. And the question is, what drove those numbers up? Simple answer, man-made conflict, and 2, climate change. Then COVID comes on top of that. The number went from 135 million to 276 million people on the planet marching towards starvation, not knowing where their next meal is coming from, creating debt of the poorest of the poor nations around the world to get through with safety net programs. And the coping capacity was exhausted by the poorest of the poor in these countries. We thought that we would have COVID behind us, but it recycled again and again, devastating the poorest of the poor. And so just when you think it couldn't get worse, you had Afghanistan, you had Ethiopia, and then you have Ukraine. So the number has now gone to 345 million people that are marching to starvation. That's not chronic hunger. That's a whole different discussion. Now, what's really troubling is within that number are 50 million people in 45 countries knocking on famine's door. So if you want to see which countries could have famine, destabilization, and mass migration, those are the first 45 countries to take a look. And this is why it's so important that the people of Germany, the government of Germany is stepping up in unprecedented ways to get us through this short-term crisis, of which we are not even close to getting out of yet, but we're moving in the right direction. Because now we're facing not just a food pricing problem with fuel, Ukraine, and everything combined together, this perfect storm within a perfect storm. Now we have a fertilizer crisis. And the fuel crisis is compounding that because, as you know, fuel cost is the basis for fertilizer. And if we don't address and resolve the fertilizer crisis, because we feed, we meaning the world, 8 billion people now on an annualized basis. Half of that is because of fertilizer. So we've got to move fertilizers. We've got to get through this crisis while we continue to work with strategic programs that allow particularly the most vulnerable not to be so vulnerable to these shocks. This is why we are so excited about the programs that we have been working on in the past few years and look forward. For example, places like in Niger, where climate shocks and extremist groups exploit. When we come in with these types of sustainable resilience development programs, because I can tell you, I've had mother after mother tell me, Mr. Beasley, my son or my husband did not want to join ISIS or Al-Qaeda, but we hadn't fed our little girl in 2 weeks. What were we supposed to do? But when we come in with water harvesting programs, land rehabilitation programs, putting down water wells and capturing the water, it's amazing what happens. And when we, particularly when we have homegrown school meals and complementary programs together, here's what happens. Migration drops off the chart because people don't want to leave home. But if they don't have food, they have no choice. We saw that in the Syria crisis, and it cost us 1,000 times more by failing to act in time. We learned from that. But migration drops, teen pregnancy, marriage rates of 12 and 13-year-olds drops, recruitment by extremist groups drops. It's an incredibly positive investment. So when you do have a shock like Ukraine, the most vulnerable are not impacted nearly as bad, and the cost is then a lot less. So it's a great investment. And so what we're talking about here today is extremely important. So getting through this short-term crisis, but as we also look to the type of investments in the future that create greater global food security so that we are not globally so fragile as we are today. The next 12 to 24 months are going to be difficult. 2023 is a year at this stage that we're worried about food availability. Right now it's food pricing. And with the inflation of the dollar, skyrocketing food costs, let me just give you an example of the World Food Program. Our costs are now an additional $75 million per month because of fuel costs, food costs, shipping costs. And imagine the impact on the poorest of the poor. I've got women in Afghanistan, for example, with the cold winter months coming, or in Syria, saying, Mr. Beasley, because of inflation and lack of jobs and opportunity, I either have to buy heating fuel or cooking fuel. I can't buy both. Do I starve my children or do I freeze my children? And when we don't have the support we need, we have to take money, food from the hungry children to give to the starving children. So this is why it's so critical that Germany has stepped up in such an extraordinary way. And the leadership of this country and the G7 presidency, truly providing the voices necessary at a time like this, is absolutely essential to stability of planet Earth. We are at a fragile state. But I do believe with the leadership that we're seeing out of Germany, we'll get through this. But it's going to be 1 month, 1 day at a time. And so it's always an honor to be here working with an incredible practical team. As you can imagine, that's important to us. We are logistics, emergency operations, and development, and it's very important that we work with governments and ministries that are practical. And it's been such a great success story, but we've got a lot of work ahead of us. So thank you very much.
Vielen Dank, Mr. Beasley. Sie haben jetzt die Gelegenheit für Fragen. Wenn Sie uns über WebEx zugeschaltet sind, dann schreiben Sie Ihren Namen in den Chat. aber hier im Raum können Sie ganz einfach die Hand heben. Bitte schön, Frau Kollegin von der Deutschen Welle, bitte schön.
Frau Ministerin, Julia Saudelli, Deutsche Welle. Deutschland ist der zweitgrößte Geldgeber des WFP und seine Mittel zunehmend erhöht in den letzten Jahren. Wie werden Sie das hohe Finanzierungsniveau behalten, wenn wir an eine Rezession gucken und eine schwierige Wirtschaftslage? Mr. Beasley, how do you expect the war in Ukraine to continue to affect the food situation worldwide in the coming months and year? And how worried are you about dropping financing coming from countries, for example, in Europe, looking at the difficult economic situation developing worldwide? Thank you.
Sollen wir direkt an? Ja, ich fange mal an. Ja, Deutschland ist schon seit Jahren der zweitwichtigste Geber im weltweiten Bereich der Ernährungssicherheit. Wir bauen unsere Unterstützung weiter aus, aber wir haben ja in dieser weltweiten Krise gesehen und auch mit den steigenden Kosten, dass das nicht reicht. Wir brauchen einfach mehr Länder, die Geld geben. Und deswegen ist dieses globale Bündnis für Ernährungssicherheit so wichtig, weil das zusätzliches Geld auch nochmal aktiviert hat. Wir haben es alleine in der G7-Präsidentschaft jetzt geschafft, 4,5 Milliarden Euro Zusagen zu bekommen, alleine in Elmau bei dem zentralen Treffen. Das zeigt, dass solche Aktivitäten, wie wir sie mit dem globalen Bündnis für Ernährungssicherheit vorangebracht haben, dass die auch dazu führen, dass man weiteres Geld sozusagen organisieren kann. Und ja, der Haushalt in Deutschland ist auch unter Druck. Wir haben weniger Geld zur Verfügung, aber wir geben weiterhin sehr viel Geld an das Welternährungsprogramm. Wir tun das direkt über den Haushalt, wo Sie das auch finden können. Wir tun es aber auch in vielen einzelnen Projekten in den Ländern. Wir arbeiten sehr intensiv in Ländern zusammen und deswegen kommen auch aus der bilateralen Zusammenarbeit noch zusätzliche Mittel dann eben über das World Food Program zu den Menschen. Wir haben sehr, sehr gute Erfahrungen in der Zusammenarbeit mit dem Welternährungsprogramm gemacht, weil das Hilfe ist, die wirklich ankommt, die wirkt, die nachhaltig ist. Und deswegen ist das etwas, was wir auf jeden Fall fortsetzen werden.
This financing issue is an issue of great concern, of course. Fortunately, major players like the United States and Germany recognize the gravity of the situation and recognize the catastrophic consequences if you fail to act. We experienced that in the Syrian war. Mm-hmm. The World Food Program can reach a Syrian inside Syria for less than 50 cents per day. That same Syrian ends up in Germany or Belgium, or it's over 70 euros per day. Just on that alone is 140 times the cost. And so you understand the significance. As I tell some of my friends in the parliament, in the Bundestag, it's like if you've got leaking water lines in your ceiling and you ignore it, well, I don't have the money to fix the leaking water lines. Well, in a short period of time, you're going to have to replace all the furniture, all the flooring, all the carpet, all the walls, all the curtains. It's going to cost you a lot more not to fix the leaking water lines. And as I told sometimes my friends in Congress in Washington, I said, quit fighting over where to put the buckets. Go up there and fix the water lines. Root cause. And this is where Germany is so focused. One thing that also makes me proud is that you're now seeing countries like Germany and the United States and others collaborate more strategically. There is not going to be enough money to address every need in the world over the next couple of years. There's too many demands. But as I say, it's like the ship facing icebergs, like the Titanic. You've got some spilt wine on the carpet in the ballroom, and you got an iceberg out front. I think we would like to clean up the wine on the carpet, but right now let's focus on the icebergs. So if we prioritize over the next 24 months, we'll get through these 24 months. Now, having said that, while the United States, Germany, and a few others are really stepping up, there are some countries that need to step up. For example, the Gulf states. With oil prices being so high, profits may be $1 billion a day, and oil prices not only affect shipping and fuel costs, of course, but it affects the fertilizer cost and food production. So they have a moral obligation, in my opinion, to step up in an unprecedented way. Just give me a week's worth of your net profits. Is that too much to ask? Or at least help the humanitarian crisis in your region, like Yemen and Lebanon and Syria and Jordan and Somalia, which will take pressure off, for example, Germany and the United States to do more strategic work in the Sahel, in the Horn, in Central America, in Afghanistan, and places like that. This is a critical time to be critically thinking and making critical, important, effective, strategic decisions. And so Germany's doing that. I just need a few others to do it too.
Gibt es weitere Fragen? Bitte schön.
Danke. Das sind zwei Fragen, so two questions. I guess both of them kind of go to Mr. Beasley, one of them to you, Ms. Schulze. Ich frage mit der Deutschen an, or maybe I will start with both. So how can we get other countries to like support as well? You just mentioned it with the Gulf states, right? So they should support in their humanitarian crisis as well. I just wonder, what else can we do than just speaking to them? Is there some political pressure necessary? And then, Mr. Beasley, one question that only goes to you: how do you prioritize which acute situation should be treated first?
Martin or Tom, I picked up about half of what you said. I don't hear real well. I need. Okay, here we go.
Ja. Ich starte mal mit der ersten Frage. Ja, also wie kriegen wir andere Staaten dazu mitzumachen? Das ist, glaube ich, der internationale Druck, der enorm wichtig ist. Und dieses globale Bündnis für Ernährungssicherheit hat uns da wirklich weitergebracht, weil es hat das Thema auf die Tagesordnung gehoben. Es ist viel stärker darüber diskutiert und berichtet worden. Es ist wahrgenommen worden, in welcher Situation wir uns da gerade befinden. Und das hat auch dazu geführt, dass sich mehr einfach beteiligt haben. Und ich bin fest davon überzeugt, dass dieses globale Bündnis noch weiter vorangetrieben werden muss, dass wir weiter daran arbeiten müssen, auch Staaten noch dazu zu kriegen. 100 Staaten und Organisationen ist gut nach so einer kurzen Zeit. Aber das reicht noch nicht. Wir wollen noch mehr an Bord haben, um wirklich noch mehr Mittel zu haben und auch besser koordinierte Mittel zu haben, weil das ist ja eben durch David Beasleys Beitrag nochmal sehr deutlich geworden. Es reicht nicht, jetzt unmittelbar Hilfe zu leisten in der akuten Situation. Wir müssen auch längerfristig dazu beitragen, dass die Länder, die Probleme haben, dass die Entwicklungsländer, dass die vor allen Dingen selber Lebensmittel anpflanzen können, und zwar Lebensmittel, die an die veränderten klimatischen Bedingungen angepasst sind, dass Landwirtschaft nach vorne getrieben wird, dass Dünger vorhanden ist. Diese längerfristige Arbeit ist enorm wichtig, um die nächste Hungerkatastrophe abzumildern und möglichst zu vermeiden. Ja.
Dass sich mehr Länder dazu bereit erklärt haben, bei dem Bündnis für Ernährungssicherheit mitzumachen. Sind es denn tatsächlich auch diese kritischen Länder, wie zum Beispiel die Golfstaaten?
Nein, die brauchen wir noch. Da wird der Druck auch weitergehen. Wir haben ja jetzt G7 mit an Bord. Wir müssen noch mehr aus dem G20-Bündnis dazu bekommen, auch mehr zu machen. Diese Herausforderung bleibt noch. Ja.
And then let me add on, how do we prioritize? It's not that complicated, quite frankly. We have a system in place, we call it IPC levels of the most critical, you're at famine level, I call it starvation level. We have a different classification system that's quite intricate and very effective. And we work with the donor countries in prioritizing. When we don't have enough funds, this is what gets difficult. Then we end up having to take food from hungry children and give to starving children. And as you can imagine, that's a cycle that's just absolutely horrible. There's $430 trillion worth of wealth on planet Earth today. It's inexcusable any child on the planet would die. And when you think of the simple fact that every 4 to 5 seconds a child dies from hunger-related issues, you know, shame on us, especially when, in the height of COVID, the world's billionaires' net worth increase was $5.2 billion per day. Is it too much to ask the private sector to step up at a time like this? Is it too much to ask the Gulf oil producing countries to step up at a time like this? It's not right that the United States and Germany are bearing this burden. But fortunately, Germany and the United States are not waiting, because people can't wait to eat. It's like on climate issues. While the industrialized nations talk about mitigation, families have got to survive this week with adaptation. And this is why the programs that we're talking about are so powerful. I wish you could go with me and see what happens. I was just out in the field, out like, and this was in Niger and Chad, just in the last month or so, and talking with women that I had met with 2 years ago. And historically, the old way was just give food and give food and give food, and you'll be doing that forever. Versus coming in and putting down a water well, helping them put down water lines for irrigation. And I had this mother named Biba, and they brought all the women together in a cooperative. And I can tell you, if you want to learn about entrepreneurial spirit, you don't have to go to the Business School of Economics here in Germany or Harvard in the United States. Go meet an African woman. Holy mackerel. It was so exciting. She stood there with so much pride with her female counterparts and said, Mr. Beasley, now because you've no longer just give us fish, you've taught us how to fish. That's how she phrased it. She said, look at the garden here. We're now feeding our families, selling into the marketplace. We're buying clothes for our children, medicine for our children. And she then said, and I'm paying for my son's wedding. So when a shock like Ukraine happens, the impact is so much less. These are the type of investments. And so when we are given the flexibility, and this is not just a short term, this is long term. Give us the flexibility, and Germany's doing that so that we can come in and invest in such a way that families can withstand these types of shocks. Let me just give you a few numbers that will be shocking to you. Just in the past several years, because of flexible funding, we, and I mean we, our beneficiaries working with us, have rehabilitated over 3.5 million acres that's now growing food for families or fodder for animals, whatever it might be. Over 109,000 small ponds, small dams, and reservoirs. 81,000 kilometers of feeder roads. 26,000 kilometers of water canals and irrigation lines that they're now taking care of themselves. These are the type programs that allow the most vulnerable of the most vulnerable in areas that are impacted so much so by climate shocks, whether you're talking about the Horn of Africa or Sahel or wherever it may be. These are the type of investments that are critical. These are the type of investments that pay back 100-fold, because otherwise you end up with famine, destabilization, mass migration. 2007 and 2008, and in the Arab Spring, because of food inflation and pricing, there were 48 nations with civil unrest, riots, and protests. The economic factors today are much worse than then. You are already beginning to see the tip of the icebergs in places like Sri Lanka, Burkina Faso, some in Chad, Peru, Panama, Haiti, and let me keep going. It's only going to get worse as pricing continues to be a problem and the lack of fertilizer creating an availability problem. Now, the other last, real quick, Ukraine. We are moving grains out of Ukraine now because of the Black Sea Grain Initiative. We're moving grains out. Extraordinary success story, but it's a very fragile agreement. We're trying to move the fertilizers. Hopefully we'll have some fertilizer moving next week, but I don't want to get ahead of myself. We're in negotiations on that now into the details. That hopefully will calm the commodity market, calm the fertilizer market down. But I know some reporters a few weeks ago when we had the first ships moving on the Black Sea Grain Initiative, sort of victoriously said, commodity markets are now down to pre-war levels. I'm like, well, whoa, pre-war levels were already 2 to 3 times what the prices were a couple of years ago, and a lot of poor people had coping capacity back then. And by the way, inflation and the valuation of the dollar has just wiped all that out for the poorest of the poor. So, but going forward, I'm hopeful as to Ukraine grain production, but you still got a war that, as we all know, we don't know how it's going to unfold. But I admire the Ukrainian farmers, how they are doing the best they can. And, I think we've seen pictures where some of them will have bulletproof vests while they're driving the tractors and things like that, But God knows this is a difficult time. But if we don't get ahead of it, it will be hell on earth next year. It's bad enough right now. Anyway.
I have one follow-up question, I'm sorry. Do you think that all these emotional stories and rhetorical questions will make the Gulf states and other states cooperate in these initiatives? Because one thing is like initiating initiatives, one thing is like asking rhetorical questions, if like private business people, if other rich states could participate as well. The other question is how much political pressure would be needed to make them literally participate finally and not leave the burden to the United States and Germany.
Und das würde ich dann noch kombinieren mit der Frage von AP, dann haben wir das gebündelt.
Yeah, this is just for you, Mr. Beasley, just quick, if you could give us a more local example of what the WFP is doing in Somalia. We have seen this very severe drought, probably the worst one in the last 40 years. Famine is on the brink. What is WFP doing, especially, as you said, you try to plan long term, but with the grain situation, you just can't ship and help with the food every day. Can you give us an evaluation of what's going on right now and what you're doing to mitigate this problem? Thank you.
Yeah, then 2 things. One, on pressure is critical. And it's going to be pressure that must come from nations that have the ability to put pressure. And that's essential right now. It really is, number one. Number 2 is Somalia is really a country that's facing an extraordinary crisis. Why? For a variety of long-term reasons. But then the short term, we're now in the 5th season of back-to-back dry seasons. I was just there a few weeks ago. I was in northern Kenya, Somalia, and the Somali region of Ethiopia, so watching literally before me. And in many of these places, livestock is the only livelihood they have. And their goats, their cattle, everything were dying. And women were just destitute and desperate. It was heartbreaking. So we've come in, yes, of course, with food security programs, but we're also doing land rehabilitation programs that capture a little bit of water, like what we call half moons, and capturing enough water at least for them to grow some fodder for the animals, grow some food to survive, so they don't get exploited by Al-Shabaab and other extremist groups. Nutrition programs, children's programs, homegrown school meal type programs. We're short of the funds we need. Fortunately, the United States and Germany have stepped up in ways that to help fill that void, but it's not enough given what we're facing now compared to where we were a few years ago, because you heard me give the numbers. And we went from 80 million now to 345 million people that are on the brink of starvation. And those are big numbers, but I can break those numbers down into what neighborhoods. These are people with names and children and mothers, and so this isn't just a generic number. As I've heard, why should I send my money down to help the, I'm like, well, come with me and let me show you this starving child. And let me go tell you what's going to happen if you don't go down there and give us the resources, because you're going to pay for it 100-fold in another way. And let's get ahead of it. And so in Somalia, and we can get a little bit later after we finish this, a lot of detailed numbers, as well as showing you some projects, a video or whatever you might want on Somalia. There's a lot of work to do in Somalia. I don't want to give anybody the impression that we're out of the woods there at all, because it's a serious, serious issue there in that whole region.
darf Sie ergänzend noch auf die Pressemitteilung hinweisen, die Sie auf unserer Website finden. Da ist auch ein Sachstand veröffentlicht mit konkreten Projektbeispielen, die wir mit den Sondermitteln des BMZ finanziert haben. Vielen Dank, Mr. Beasley, vielen Dank, Frau Ministerin, und vielen Dank Ihnen für Ihr Interesse. Bis zum nächsten Mal.